So we just got done interviewing Amy Simmons and Krispin Mayfield. They are therapists from Portland, and we talked about attachment theory and the intersection of attachment theory and spirituality.
Yeah, and I got an education.
You did.
It was really incredible. We also talked about spirituality and how these all are interwoven.
Yeah. And how they play out in church culture sometimes, right?
Yeah, church culture.
Certain attachment styles that are insecure attachment styles, there's a lot of unhealth that comes with that. But they also talked about what secure attachment style is all about too, right?
Yeah, which is really, really good. I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. They're profoundly insightful in life, but also all of it is very much connected to our faith, our personal walk with God.
And they have their own podcast, which they'll talk about, but it's called Attached to the Invisible. So make sure you guys give them a listen because they're really good.
Yeah, we know you're going to enjoy this, guys. Thanks for coming on this journey with us.
Thanks. Jason, I'm excited for you. You're here with 3 therapists.
I know.
This is gonna be so good for you.
Yeah.
No, I'm really glad that Jason is here because all our therapist language, he's gonna be able to be like, hey, by the way, what does this actually mean in like human terms?
Yeah. And I was just looking for an opportunity to get some help for free. So this is great.
We're really excited that you guys are here with us today. I've been a fan. Well, in our previous phone conversations, I've been telling everybody about y'all's podcast and how helpful it's been in regards to understanding attachment theory, but the intersection of attachment theory and spirituality, and how it can actually be it's just a really good tool to know and to understand in regards to our own, what do we want to use? What language, like faith walk or spirituality or whatever language you want to use. And in our podcast, a lot of the people that listen are going through some kind of, for lack of a better term, deconstruction, or asking lots of questions about some of the evangelical or charismatic spaces that they've been in. So I'd love to maybe, the way we start is just asking you guys just an overview of attachment theory and the different attachment styles. And then maybe the second half of it could be more about the intersection of that with our own spirituality and our own walk with God. Maybe we can start there. How would you guys go about talking about just an overview of attachment theory?
I mean, the way that I look at it at its base is like that we have this drive within us to connect with other people around us, specifically people that, to connect to at least one special person.
Yeah.
Usually a parent early in life, right? We need that connection. And really, like, we will do whatever we can in order to get that connection. And sometimes we're in a healthy enough environment where it's just like, I just reach out and I get the connection I need. And then there are times where it's not healthy enough to be able to do that. And you have to come up with like plan B. And that plan B, whether it's like, I'm going to hold my emotions back so I don't scare you away, or like, I have to get really loud and big before I get your attention. Those tend to develop patterns in how we relate to people, and if it, God as well, in the rest of our life kind of sets us up that way. And then also acknowledging that like that's not entirely static. These dynamics show up in every relationship in different nuanced ways.
And I really like to think about attachment or attachment theory as something that kind of affirms, right? Like Krispin's talking about, something that really affirms the fact that we are built for relationship and connection. And therefore, this like base human need we have, the way that gets responded to and treated is going to form how we relate to other humans, right? It's going to be formative. I always use the phrase with clients and also with like interns, right? People that I like work with and I'm coaching, that like bad behavior that goes unchecked always gets worse. And I think that's true with attachment, right? There's all this space to like heal and change and grow if we weren't offered secure attachment as kids. But if it goes unchecked, if it's something we don't examine in ourselves, those patterns are only going to intensify throughout our lives.
That's really good. I love what you guys said in one episode about how attachment theory is essentially a relational theory, because a lot of, I know Jason's heart and my heart too, is that any kind of conversation about spirituality has to be within the context of relationship and family. And so I think this is going to be really helpful in just helping people think about not only relationship with God, but relationship with others.
Yeah. And one thing that I would add is you were talking about the deconstruction aspect of it. What I find most helpful about attachment theory and looking at spirituality through that lens is that when you look and you see like these dynamics in a like parent-child relationship have been shown to cause these feelings, then it's like, oh, this totally makes sense. Like if you grew up with a parent where it's like you have to like walk this line of acting perfectly in order to get close to them, then you're going to be anxious all the time. You read that and you're like, wait a minute, maybe I didn't even realize that I've like felt like anxious my whole life. Like I had to get it just right.
Right.
But that totally makes sense that like if that was the way that I was taught, like if I'm close to God, I'm being good. If I'm far from God, I'm being bad. Right. If that's the way that I've learned to approach spirituality, of course I'm going to be anxious. And what do you know, there's actual research that shows like that our nervous system actually in a relationship like that carries that anxiety.
And that's so great too, because I think that you can also apply it back the other way too, right? Which is, this is a thing that happens to people with like attachment theory all the time. When they have a first time experience of a secure attachment, sometimes that can really like shatter a mythos that they had about their family of origin, right? Of like, oh, I didn't know I could feel that way in relationship with another person. And I think sometimes it can really work that way with our spirituality too, where when we start to examine like, oh, I can actually feel like loved and secure and safe with God. Sometimes that's the catalyst for deconstruction, right? Was like, oh, that actually isn't that anxiety, right? Or that avoidance or that numbness. Those aren't actually requirements for my relationship with God. That was something unhealthy that I was taught. That's not God, right?
Right. That's good. I went to Bible college, and after I finished Bible college, my wife for a brief minute suggested that I pursue a counseling degree. And I thought, that's a really good idea. So I looked into it and decided that was way too much work. It was way too much schooling, and I'm not much of an academic. So the joke is that I decided I'd go into family pastoring, which is essentially basically getting paid a whole lot less and having a whole lot less tools, but being thrown in the deep end at the end of the day, and you find yourself in the room having to navigate waters that are probably highly unqualified to navigate in many ways, except I have the Holy Spirit that lives within me. I always refer to myself as I'm not much of an academic, but I am a relational theologian. Which means everything is birthed out of relationship. Everything is about relationship. He's a relational God. Jesus came to show us God, but not as master or as savior or as provider. Those were all attributes of one name. He called him Dad. And so everything was this expression of family. He often referred to the kingdom, but the kingdom is perfectly revealed through family, or it isn't kingdom. So what I would find myself often doing is I'm in a room and I had one fallback. Now, in fairness to me, I grew up in a house with mom and dad that were together, that loved each other, that revealed this kind of loving father to me. But my one fallback to be able to navigate some of these waters was love, was family, was what does healthy family look like? And often what I would find was you would find yourself going back to their childhood. And again, I would often say, I am not a counselor, but you would find yourself going back to their childhood. And a lot of things were connected to their interactions with their parents, which were about their value, their identity, but also connected to what they believed about God. They seemed to always be connected. And that God took on the image often of what mom and dad were like. And I'm curious with you guys as believers, when you're in the room and you're speaking to somebody, how often you see the connection between what they believe about God and what they believe about their parents, and how that impacts their lives today, and how you address that.
I know Krispin has specific research on this topic, so I'm going to let him talk about that because, again, he always knows the words and I'm just sort of saying things. But just for me to clarify, so I don't do like specifically Christian counseling, right?
Yeah.
I'm a social worker, so I work out in the community and I do a lot of like sort of ad lib in the moment type of stuff. I do have some more like therapeutic clients as well, but a lot of what I do is just like kind of showing up with people. Sometimes I feel like I get the pastoring thing, right? I had a social work professor who said, you can be a social worker from 9 to 5, or you could be a social worker 24/7. And I really like kind of took that in, right? Like, I'm a social worker, I'm a Christian. These things are the same thing for me, right? They're married to each other.
That's true.
That's a side though. But I often find that the way that people, I mean, this is why attachment theory is so appealing, right? Is because it is so easy to see the way that people's primary experiences of connection, whether they're broken or whole, define the way that people see themselves in a space and therefore what they manifest around them. Right? To be very clear and trauma informed, right? One of the things we tell trauma survivors a lot, right, is the things that you do, the things that you did to survive kept you alive, right? We can honor that. We can be thankful for that. And we can also put it down now that we're not in survival mode. And that's very true about a lot of our attachment patterns as well, right? So you take somebody who has an ambivalent attachment style, and we can take a classic example here, right? They have a parent who's struggling with addiction, right? So sometimes parent shows up to the space super loving and present and enthusiastic and ready to care for their needs. And sometimes parent is physically, chemically incapable of showing up in love and attention and responsiveness, right? And so what they learn is to gauge when they ask for things, how they ask for things. What they learn is to pay so much attention to every detail of a situation so that they know when they can and can't get their needs met and how to meet the adult in their life's needs, right? They reverse these roles. Are y'all all parents?
I'm not.
You're not. Okay. I'm not a parent. I just happen to know a lot of kids. But you watch parents and children, and ideally, right, the child has the space to be inconsistent and the parent exists as secure. But when you have kids who develop ambivalent attachments, a lot of times what they experienced was a reversal of that.
Right.
So then they take that out into the world with them, right? Even once they're not in that household, they take that into the world with them and they go, I'm always watching, I'm always maneuvering, I'm always sort of playing with how I show up in the space so that I can make sure that I'm safe and I can get my needs met, but I'm super in control of the situation. Is one example, right? These things can manifest in a lot of different ways. And to have healing and loving and joyful relationship, right? At some point, they have to stop managing who they are to meet the needs of another person and actually show up authentically. So you watch people not just learn these things, but then go out into the world and manifest relationships that repeat them because that's what they know how to do. And that's where they feel safe. And that's where they're drawn to, which is where the like deconstruction and the learning becomes really important. Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah, I have a lot of feelings about like, how does our early relationships correlate with our perception of God? I have like personal bias because I've been in churches and I don't come from a secure attachment background. And so I was always like wondering, like, is it just me? Is it because of my own trauma that I'm like hearing these things, at church, that God doesn't like me, that God wishes I was a little bit better, that, like,
Sure.
And I was talking in like, kind of this sense of like God has God's needs. And like God needs me to affirm, God needs me to work, like this is all about God.
To give the glory.
Right. And so I had a friend, another therapist, my friend Kyle, and I was sharing this with him. And he's like, I think that you're a gift to the church because you grew up in a dysfunctional family. Like you have a special radar for picking up on those dysfunctional aspects that show up in the church.
Yeah.
And one thing that we know, research shows, is that parenting styles and theology actually correlate. Maybe not theology. Specifically, this study was like a culture-specific concept of God and a culture's parenting practices correlate. So
yes.
If you have a harsh, judgmental, critical God, you're going to have harsh, judgmental, critical parenting. So then the question is like, which came first?
Right.
The other thing that comes up that I've noticed anecdotally is that people that come to the church later in life don't have as much baggage around this. And I think some of that is because of what I just mentioned, but I've been really curious. This is just a question I have. So much of our attachment is in our relational brain. It's not in our logical brain. Mm-hmm. And when we're kids, we're giving these really powerful metaphors often. And I think they're not always helpful metaphors. So like a metaphor of like, you're dirty and your heart is dirty and God can't stand being around you. Like if you're told that at 3 or 4 or 5 years old, that's going to like that metaphor and that image is going to like get kind of sink in your brain in a way that like Jesus loves you and died on the cross for you isn't the same, because that's a verbal statement. And this thing is a powerful metaphor. Uh-huh. And we have in the church a lot more powerful metaphors for like our sinfulness or our separation than we do for being loved. And in my upbringing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really good.
One of the parenting styles that we adopted fairly early on, again, because I grew up in a loving environment and my wife as well, we still had an angry God, a part of our narrative, certainly, but we were experiencing love, and that experience was more real than, what was being taught from the pulpit. So for us, I feel like in many ways we had a leg up. We had a whole lot of health in our marriage and then in parenting. And so it was very early on in our first child where we realized, and we phrase it this way, that I'm more interested in your identity than your behavior. And so what would happen is if you were to catch your child in a lie, we do want to talk about, and of course, when they're young, you're not necessarily going to be able to lay out all the consequences that lying would have. But ultimately, you want to be able to have that open conversation. Lying will have consequences. Mm-hmm. It will affect trust and relationship and so on and so forth. But the number one thing that was always our approach was, but you're not a liar. You're actually a truth teller, that your identity. And for us, that's very much tied to our faith, that Jesus revealed to us our innate value and he restored us to that. So that's what the narrative of the cross is it's this restoration of our ability to see our innate value and then be able to live from that place. And so we would have this saying in our house that behavior follows identity. And if you can speak to identity over and over and over again, that behavior will follow behind that. And often I feel like the church flips the narrative and they teach behavior, and behavior determines your identity. And then we have all these people trapped with an angry God. And I love when you begin to flip that. And I could see that, the freedom that's brought into our lives and into our kids' lives. And if you guys want to speak to that.
Well, yeah, I know that you recently talked with Mako on the podcast interview.
Yeah.
And he and I were talking. He does a lot of healing atonement theology. Yeah. And we were talking about like in the evangelical church, what I was always told was like, you might look good on the outside, but like underneath it all, you're really rotten to the core. And we need to like flip that, right? Like you might have these like behaviors that are hurting yourself, hurting others on the outside, but like at the core, you're a child of God and you're made in the image of God.
That's it. Yeah. That's good.
Yeah. One thing Krispin and I have talked about a lot that Krispin has some really great ideas about, and I hope that he'll also write a book about this someday, is the idea of like a trauma-informed church. Krispin was really the first person who, even though I've been very familiar with trauma-informed care, Krispin was the first person who really brought the idea that like, oh yeah, that belongs in our church. And I think about the fact that like I run a sex trafficking prevention program. That's part of what I do. And we talk about trauma-informed care all the time because we're talking to like classrooms full of kids, and we need, and this totally relates in my heart to like doing church better, right? What I say in front of a classroom full of kids has to be able to apply to the variable experience of 35 children, right? Some of whom who have like never heard the word sex said out loud before, and some of whom who have absolutely experienced some of its atrocities already, right? Like this is the reality when you have a room full of 35 kids, just statistically. So you have to be able to speak into that space in a way that's creating both safety and information. So one of the rules that I have for my staff is we don't say good or bad. We don't say right or wrong. We talk about healthy and helpful, right?
That's good.
Right? All we talk about is healthy and helpful. And just thinking about like, man, if the church took that on, right? I was having a great conversation with someone the other day who's also a therapist, and he was talking about, we were talking about sin, right? And what do we believe about sin and what is sin? And I was sharing some of my beliefs about like what I think sin actually is versus what we're told it is, right? Because sin is the behavior, right? That's what we're taught when we're kids. This is right, this is wrong, this is right, this is wrong, this is good, bad. You wouldn't do this if you really loved God. Right. That's a huge one. Boy, oh boy, if that's not like the narrative of an abusive parent, right?
Yeah, no kidding,
right? I tell kids in the classroom all the time, the phrase, if you love me, then you will, is an emotional abuse phrase. But we apply that onto God all the time.
Yeah.
We tell kids that God's emotionally abusive. That's a narrative we have for children in the church. How insane is that?
Yeah.
Crazy. And
it
so
is crazy.
If we start to frame things that leave space for healthy and helpful, right? Like what is connective, what works for you, what brings you closer to God, right? Versus like a prescription for what brings us closer to God, right? Like what intensifies and invests and connects relationship, right? And then we might have kids who grow up to stay in the church instead of like a vast deconstruction of people who are throwing the Jesus out with the bathwater because what they were taught about who God is does not connect with what they've grown up to learn actual healthy, loving relationship is.
That's so good.
Wow.
So good.
That'll preach right there.
That'll preach. My wife was a children's pastor in one of the more recent churches we were connected in. And my wife, well, she's going to be like cheering what you just said, but she got rid of every book that painted God as a father who's complicit in the murder of his sons. And then when she found a good book, even then, some of these kids' Bibles, she's like, I can't even believe what they're writing in these books. And she literally found black marker, and she, FBI documents you get, or the CIA, she blacked out all the lies about that narrative that the father is somehow complicit, demanding the death of his son. And yet, because that's so woven into our theology, it is passed right down to our kids. And what a messed up, I love that you call it abuse, because it really is. And that's how my wife and I feel about it as well.
It's funny. I grew up and my parents whited out the number of years ago that my dinosaur book said that the earth was started.
That's hilarious.
All sorts of forms of censorship, aren't there?
Yes, there is.
Maybe what would be helpful is to, I don't know how you guys would want to approach it, but to talk about the different attachment styles and what they are. But what I really want to get into is really how those apply to our own walk and spirituality, and what a secure relationship, a secure attachment style looks like too.
Yeah. Secure is always the most boring. I'm kind of kidding.
I was going to say, that's the one we can get out of the way, right? A secure attachment, beautiful thing, right? When you have like, again, a primary adult, right? Because when we talk about true attachment theory is about like 0 to 18-month-olds, I think is like the like baseline, and sort of the way we form attachment and sensory.
And these years are some of the most, like that's the most important time in a child's life to some extent, right?
Yeah, one of the things that a lot of people find both difficult and powerful about attachment theory is the idea that 0 to 18 months, you don't remember that.
Right.
Right? Like this is a time before, these are not conscious memories that you have. So like I can give the example of like, for instance, like I grew up in a house with a like parent with a severe mental health disorder. And I don't remember what that looked like when I was a baby. I can fill in the lines, right? Of, well, what did it look like when I was 12? I can kind of figure out probably what a lot of that looked like. But I don't have the information about how my parent treated me when I was a baby. But I do have the sense experiences, right, that very much match with a parent with like very severe depression and anxiety, and what the responsiveness of a parent who's not coping what that looks like, right? I have those sense experiences. I brought those forward with me. Yeah, so secure attachment, I always think it's most helpful to kind of give the example, right? Is you have a parent who is able to be responsive to their needs, and so the child feels secure, right? They feel safe. They feel like if I have a problem, my parent will respond. Yeah. And also that kind of creates a response in infants, right? And in babies where we see kids not react super, super big if they're left alone for a short period of time because they know their parent's coming back, right? So it's not just the, if I cry, I'll be okay. It's actually just the I'm okay, right? Yeah. It's a deep sense and behavioral reflection of the sense that I am actually okay and taken care of, and I will be okay and taken care of. I'm not experiencing doubt or anxiety about that.
Yeah, and that doesn't mean that as parents, because, I think there's a lot of like anxiety that comes up as a parent when you hear about this. As parents, it doesn't mean that we have to be on all the time. Really, it's just during these moments when we're sad or scared or like have a need, right? Yeah. So if your baby is crawling around on the floor, happy as a clam, that's fine. But right, when she needs you, right, do you respond? And research seems to indicate that like you need to respond 50% of the time. So you can get it wrong half the time and you'll still have a secure attachment, right? Because there's times where like my kids are older, but you're driving home and kids crying in the back and it's like, I wish I could pick you up and hold you right now. But we just you're going to scream for 20 minutes and then we'll get home. If we look at baseline, that's sort of what that is. And what it teaches us is that my needs are okay. I'm inherently lovable and worth being taken care of. Yeah. And if I reach out in the world, other people will take care of me.
Yes.
So like I'm okay and you're okay.
Good.
Yes, that I'm okay and you're okay. I always love when you remind me of that. And just to also even speak to the kind of the cry it out example, like if you're a loving, attentive parent, there isn't like one thing you can do that's going to permanently screw up your kid's attachment. Like that, one of the things that we get out of secure attachment actually is our ability to cope with the world, right? That's so good. Kids with secure attachment are actually more capable of developing coping skills because they feel safe and secure. So they feel safer to explore new options, try new things, rest, right? There's all of these benefits that come from that secure base. That actually create more independent, self-sufficient kids a lot of the time, right? Again, in a healthy way, because we're going to talk about avoidant in a little while, and that's a more self-sufficient, independent, less healthy version of things.
Isn't part of secure too, and I guess this would change over time, but a support for exploration? I mean, there's boundaries always, but like, isn't exploration a big part of that too?
Yeah, it is. The attachment system and exploration system are sort of like the yin and yang of our kind of development. So if I know that mom is going to pay attention to me when I cry, then I can go explore the playground. But if I think like mom's not going to be responsive to me, my best strategy is to like sit on the bench next to her to make sure that like I have her attention.
Well, what about some of the other attachment styles?
Yeah, so I think it's helpful to frame. You have secure, which is probably about like 60% of the population. And then you have insecure, and you have these different ways. We learn different ways of dealing with that insecurity, basically. And so the first one I think we could start with is anxious, ambivalent / preoccupied. And Amy, you love talking about this one.
I do, because I feel like it's the one I see the most, and it's me. So that's why. So anxious, ambivalent, right? Talking about this earlier when I was giving the example of like a parent with addiction, right? So a lot of times where an anxious, ambivalent style is formed out of is a parent who is inconsistent in their ability to give care. So kids learn how to get care, right? They learn, and I mean this in a very non-judgmental way, they learn how to manipulate care out of their caregiver, right? They learn how to manage the situation, right? Sure. And what that does is create something we call hypervigilance, right? Which is this constantly aware of what's happening, always paying attention to every detail of everything that's happening, which can help you understand why we also call this an anxious attachment style. when they did they did this experiment, right? And everybody can Google this. What is it called, Krispin?
The strange situation.
In the strange situation, which is sort of this initial Psych 101 experiment that you can watch. What happens with the child, right, is their parent leaves and they're sad, right? Because kids are often sad when their parents leave. And when their parent comes back, they do this thing where like a lot of the kids are like screaming, but also they're like really holding on to their parent, or they're pushing them and they're pulling them, right? They're ambivalent about their parent, right? They want them close, but they don't trust them to respond to it, right?
Right.
And so this happens a lot, again, with parents with severe mental health issues. It happens a lot with parents who struggle with addiction. It's not uncommon for kids who are bumped in and out of foster care, which can overlap with those issues to begin with, but there are also other reasons kids find themselves there. That's what we see in children. And then what we see as adults, right, is people who manifest things that maybe we would describe as codependency. We see things like borderline personality traits, and just for like people who may not know what that means, that is kind of defined by like a push-pull. We call it like idealization and demonization, right? So like, I love you, you're my best friend, no one's ever loved me as much as you've loved me, get away from me, I hate you, you're a monster, wait, no, come back, I love you so much, right?
Yeah,
right.
That's what a borderline like personality disorder manifest as. I think Krispin and I are on the same page that a lot of times we think that that's really just like a trauma response, right?
Sure.
Because again, even if someone's treating you quite horribly, you still have a need to be loved and taken care of. And so that can manifest in this ambivalence about people who love us or about the people in our lives. And again, you can look at that and go back. You can see how that manifests relationships that then continue to teach us that lesson, right? Because someone who's going to, for example, date me when I'm like, hi, I just want to love you and be next to you all the time. Now I don't want to talk to you for 2 weeks because you pissed me off. Hi, now I love you again, right? Anyone who's going to be in that relationship with me is affirming that that's a type of relationship that works, right? And so I'm continuing to build experiences that affirm that this is how the world works, right? This idea of, is this is the one, right? That's like, I'm not okay, but maybe you're okay. I'm not, right? You have something to give me and I've got to try and get you to give it to me, but I don't feel like okay or safe in myself or alone, right? A lot of time, again, things that we define as codependency in adults, right?
Yeah. Because what happens is like you have this experience of like being alone, and it's like, I don't know how to get back to you. Like once there's been like, say like once mom or dad is like drunk on the couch, right? And they're not responding to me anymore. I don't know how to get that connection back. My best strategy is to try to keep that connection all the time, because when I lose it, it's utterly terrifying. In a secure relationship, it's like I might cry for a while, but I know that mom or dad is coming back. Here, it's like, it's totally terrifying. So now I have to be on guard all the time to try to keep that connection. And so these are people that are, that anxiety plays out where it's like, I'm monitoring the relationship all the time. It's like, are we okay? Are we okay? Are we okay? And actually there's been some research that shows that people with this attachment style read facial like changes quicker than people with other attachment styles. They also go to worst case scenario. So they see like a little bit of frustration on their partner's face. And rather than thinking like, oh, this might be about they're frustrated with work, they just go like, oh my gosh, they're upset with me. They're going to break up. They're going to leave me. Right. And then what happens often is then it's like, why are you making that face at me? Right. And it goes into conflict mode. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to sort it out. They're trying to figure out like, are you leaving me or not? But it tends to wear out the people around them, because basically it feels like I need to reassure you all the time, because they need that much reassurance. I mean, John Bowlby, the founder of attachment theory, said we are only as needy as our unmet needs. These are people that have had unmet needs. And there are ways, find an EFT therapist near you to work through like how to build some security if you're, in a relationship. There are better ways to get that reassurance. But the way that I've looked at it, I've thought about it before, the metaphor is sort of like the fire alarm is going off all the time in the house of the relationship.
Yeah.
And this person has to go through every single room and be like, is this on fire? Is this on fire? And like what that feels like as the other person in the relationship is like, you're questioning everything. You're always wondering, do I really love you? And it can, again, be exhausting.
Sure.
But that's how that person has learned, like, I need to be on extra guard all the time because I'm terrified I'm going to lose you. And if I lose you, then I'm not okay. I'm totally going to be devastated and alone in the world.
How do you help people in that place? And how would that connect to maybe our spirituality even? Or am I asking a question too early? You tell me.
No, we can go whenever to that space.
Because whenever I feel like who you're describing, I think all of us have met that person. We've all, at some point in our lives, connected with someone and sensed such deep insecurity. It's fascinating to know where it's coming from. But I'd love to know too, how do you speak to that? How do you begin to unarm or disarm that type of cycle of thinking that would continually take you downward?
Yeah, great question. I think one starting point is to recognize it and notice, like, oh, I get into this panic mode, right? And to even validate that in terms of like, yeah, this makes a lot of sense. I haven't had people that have stuck around for me in my life, right? Of course, I'm going to have this response. But looking like, is there another way to be? And this can look like I do this all the time with couples where it's like, when that insecurity comes up, if you can come to your partner with real vulnerability, in a way that they can respond to well, then that's actually a way that relationships can heal that and create what we call earned secure attachment. So,
that sounds like really cool stuff. Earned secure attachment.
Right. If you if you're coming to your partner all the time and you're like, I know that you don't love me, right? Or I know that you are thinking this about me, or, then they're going to get defensive and they're going to dismiss your insecurity. And then the more they dismiss, right, the more they're like, no, like you're just making a big deal out of nothing. The more you're like, oh, they're not taking me seriously. They're pushing me away. It's true. Like the worst is going to happen. But if you can come to your partner and be like, this isn't about you. This is about like my past relationships. But today is one of those days where I'm feeling really insecure and I just need a hug. I just need to know that you like me and that you're going to stick around. Like if someone comes to you and says that, right? Like, what are you going to do? You just will like, it moves you in your compassion to just want to give them a hug and reassure them.
That's really good.
Yeah. What we find is that, that if couples can have these conversations and they can make that eye contact and they can have the body language, it's an experiential change that changes our attachment.
I love that. The experiential change, that's where it's at, isn't it? And then you call it an earned
secure attachment.
I love that. Hey guys, just a quick break to let you know that you can find Thomas and I on familystory.org. You can also sign up for the mailing list where we release weekly articles, a monthly message podcast, and then we keep you up to speed on any opportunities, teachings, travels that we're doing.
You guys can check out my Instagram page. I'm posting stuff on mental health, wholeness, inner healing. I also do a good amount of work with the Enneagram, and I'm going to be doing a couple of Facebook Lives here coming up. My Instagram handle is my first name, my middle initial, and my last name. So that's Thomas F. Floyd.
And mine is Jason Clark is.
Jason Clark is.
Yes.
Is what? Is there?
Is whatever you need him to be.
Jason
whatever you want him to be. Yeah, so go to familystory.org or check out our Instagram handles for more content and information. Bless you guys. We'll get back to this podcast.
Earned secure attachment. That can even be confusing too if we're talking about spirituality, because it's like, wait, are we earning something or
right?
So,
yeah.
But I think it's really helpful because it's actually really hopeful that even if you are on an insecure attachment style spectrum, there are things that that somebody can do to actually tap into secure attachment, right?
And I would say too, and if we're talking in that place, and you guys could speak to this, I believe that trust is earned. And I believe that it can be lost in a moment, but it takes a long time to earn it. And I believe when it comes to church and when it comes to our concept of pastors and leadership, they like to take trust and honor, and they marry them all together. I've always said trust is earned, honor you can give away right away. Honor, I can see you the way the Father sees you. I can give that to you, but I don't have to trust you. That's something you earn. And in that context, I would say God earned it a long time ago. When you actually understand what Jesus did at the cross, the trust has already been earned on his end. So,
and Amy and I have been known to say things like, God can handle you not trusting.
Yeah.
Like if
yes,
you
of course
come to God and be like, I can't trust you. Right.
Yeah.
And actually that actually ironically requires some trust, that requires some vulnerability, rather than, a lot of times we try to tell God the things that God wants to hear in order
right,
to,
right. I love that.
Right.
Yeah, he can handle it for sure.
Yeah.
And I love that actually does require trust to be able to go to him and say, I don't trust you.
Mm-hmm.
He's like, that's all
and
right.
I would say, so this is a frustration, right? To almost anyone who's sorting through anything, this is a frustrating thing to hear. So I'm just sort of bracing whoever's listening for that, including the three of you. Trust is earned. Trust is earned on both sides, though. The truth is that you do not have a trusting relationship with someone unless you're both choosing trust.
That's right.
But you're both choosing to be trustworthy and to risk trust.
Yeah, that's right.
This is something that's so awful, honestly. It's a terrible thing that the dynamics of relationship demand from people who have survived hard things, that they actually do have to do work to heal. You shouldn't have to. Let me be the first person, if no one's ever said it to you, to say that you shouldn't actually have to do the work to heal, right? I wish it was just something that could be given to you, just like secure attachment wasn't, right? Like I wish you had been given those things, but if you weren't, unfortunately, you do have to do work to heal.
Wow.
And that's not fair, and it's not okay, and it's not equitable, but it is real, right? We live in a broken world, and that is part of the brokenness of it. When you get to the other side of life, healing will be given to you, but on this side of paradise, you're going to have to work for it. And that sucks, period. But when we talk about earned attachment, like earned secure attachment, part of that, is showing up into a space and being able to, I don't want to say fake it till you make it, right? Exactly. But I do. There's a really charismatic Pentecostal part of me alive still. That's like we speak things into being, right? Like I think that there's power to words being spoken out loud. This is the main thing that I think the power of prayer is. It's actually a lot less about what I may or may not be convincing God to do, but what I am speaking into my own heart and experience through saying these things out loud, where I'm focusing my energy, right? Where I'm focusing my thoughts in my heart. So when I pray for healing for someone who's wronged me, right? What's that doing to me, right?
Yes.
God's already on top of healing them. God doesn't need my permission to do anything.
Right.
God's much bigger than that, right? Yeah. But what does it do for me to show up to that, which does not make it a demand? Please don't hear me ever saying that you there is a requirement on you to forgive people who have harmed you. You can get into whether or not that's true. I just think it's the wrong question. But yeah, so when ambivalent attachment or avoidant attachment, right, which we haven't actually defined.
We should do that next.
Yeah, but with ambivalent attachment, right, if you have someone who's really struggling to kind of the idea of being able to say hey, this is actually about my relationship with my dad and not about my relationship with you. Even if you don't believe it yet, it's okay to name something that you know is true, but you don't feel is true, right? That's okay. And it moves you farther towards that. The more you speak it out loud, you can actually convince yourself of something and do a lot of healing by speaking out truth to yourself even.
Yeah. Or even maybe it's God, I've been told that you are really angry at me and you hate my guts. And you're just waiting to turn me into someone that's perfect that you actually like. And that has made it really hard to feel safe with you in my life. And I think some of it is being open to so I talked about what that looks like in relationships. And of course you can extend that to thinking about spiritual community. But I also think that like there is this kind of relational, but also symbolic and image right side of our brain that I think can be transformed through certain like concepts or things to hang on to. And so I always encourage people to like notice, like, what is it? Is there an image? Is there something that feels very true to God's love to you? And especially when we think about anxious attachment to God, it's always like, you know, am I doing enough? Am I trying hard enough? Do I have the right theology? Like, just like, are we good? Are we good? Are we good? Right? Just all the time. Like, I'm totally responsible for this relationship. And I have to keep you close, because if I slack, then there's going to be distance, right? It's like, you know, God is like a helium balloon and we're like gripping onto it. And it's like, if I like, you know, release my grip just a little bit, it's just going to fly off into the air. And so like, noticing like, what are things that are helpful to you. And, you know, I'll get a little bit heretical, but like during times in my life, it's been like,
let's go.
It's been poetry by Hafiz, who's a Sufi Muslim mystic. But he said something about like, he has this poem that says like, it's time it's something about like, it's time to realize that there's nothing other than grace, or like there's no possibility other than grace. And like for someone who was like always told to sort of like, be careful, like you might keep sinning and you might do this and you might like, you know, just to be like, can you accept the possibility that God is completely merciful? And what would it be like?
So sarcasm alert. Are you trying to say, Krispin, that we could actually learn from people outside of the tradition, and that they might actually have something good to say about the nature of existence? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, exactly. And kind of along those lines, I've had this picture sometimes of God as like Loch Ness, like swimming in the depths of like this like unknown place. And I'm just like this like mysterious creature. This is very like kind of mystic, and you know, but I'm like, what if everything that I have known about God is not quite right? And what if there's so much that I don't understand? And what if God is so much better than I've been told my whole life? And then you can be like, okay, I know that's something helpful for me to hang on to, because as I say that, I notice my shoulders relax. I notice myself like, you know, entering into a space of safety. And so that tells me like, oh, my body is responding to that emotional safety, and it's building the secure attachment in real time. And it's different for everyone, right? Everyone has different things that are like, this is the thing that reminds me of, and I'm not talking, you know, maybe it's a Bible verse, but this isn't about, here's the thing I should believe. This is the thing that like, this speaks to me deeper than words.
Man, that is this podcast. I mean, for us, that is the heart. I'm convinced that he's better than I can think he is. And I love how you just defined, I've been in rooms where people want to argue that he's not as good as we think he is. And they're passionately about, and out of fear, out of anxiety, out of what they've been taught, out of all of those things. And I'll watch as I speak the goodness of God. I'll watch them physically come into a place of peace. And sadly, at times, I've actually watched them go, nope, shut the door again, and walls go back up. But I love that you described. I mean, I think that's what this is about. That's what faith is about. It's the discovery that he's better than you think he is, and it's safe, and there's freedom there, and there's grace there. And I love that there's an actual ability to acknowledge physically what's going on and recognize that there's a goodness available to you there. Love that, man.
So good. Yeah. Can we talk about avoidant dismissive?
That's actually a really good example of avoidant dismissive as it might show up in someone's spirituality, right? So avoidant dismissive is essentially based on the idea of, well, I'm not going to get my needs met anyway, so I opt out. That's
what needs?
What needs? Who had needs? I couldn't possibly have needs, and if you're showing up to offer any support to them, then I don't actually need you because I didn't have any needs. And we've all met people who kind of function in this way, right? I asked Krispin a question really early when we were doing our podcast, and he was like, "Yeah, that's true." Of if we see a lot of couples that are an avoidant and an ambivalent person, and how gendered that often is. And how often, right? Because toxic masculinity in our society absolutely teaches avoidant dismissive
It's John Wayne,
attachment
right?
style. Yeah, it's just like you shouldn't have needs. And we teach babies this. You will watch people react to a 2-year-old little boy with this narrative, right? And so we as a culture can also affect people's attachment styles. It turns out just your parents are not the only people affecting you. Until you're 18, cultures teach people things. And especially when kids go to school or have other caregivers, I got a lot of feelings about this. But as with everything, how surprising. But yeah, avoidant dismissive. So it can happen if you have an absentee parent, right? Somebody who's just not there. It's not uncommon for kids who experience early foster care placement or early adoption that they would experience an avoidant attachment, right? Because they had some initial breach in their attachment to their primary caregiver, right? Your primary caregiver is the first person who's taking care of you. So if there's a breach in that for some reason, and that can even happen with adoption into a loving present family, right? There's still a breach to the relationship with your immediate and primary caregiver, right? If you're adopted at 8 months old. That can create a disruption here that creates avoidant attachment. And then you just have family narratives as well, right? That can preach out an avoidant attachment style of get over it, take care of yourself. You need to do this, you need to do that. Like just you can have parents who are just kind of consistently, quite specifically dismissive.
If I could just throw something in there, there's two ways that, well, there's multiple, but there's two ways that I see like people learning this strategy to keep closeness to their parent. One is like, don't cry, stop crying. I'll give you something to cry about, which teaches me like I have to choose between my emotions or connection with my parent.
Right.
But the other is like oh honey, stop crying. It's okay. Like I'll give you, the thing that you said you wanted. And what that tells the kid is like, mom can't handle my tears or can't handle my anger. Right. And so even though I got the blue bowl when I threw a fit about it, right? Like I got what I wanted. I actually picked up also that like mom doesn't really like these negative emotions. And so if I want to keep her close and I want to keep her calm, because I need her to be calm because she's my secure base, then I have to stay calm and I have to push my needs down.
Right.
Just for clarification, because sometimes I have clients that are like, but that wasn't the narrative in my story, right? Like, or in my family, it's like, my mom's, I'm going very gendered
super
here.
Responsive.
But like, right. Yeah. My mom's very responsive. And it's like, oh, well, what happens when you're kind of worried about something? Well, she gets really, really worried. Okay. Well, yeah. If you don't want mom to be worried, then you need to not share your worry with her.
Right. Yeah.
Wow. Anyway, I find that's really helpful for people to know when they start looking at this. So
I appreciate that.
And this attachment style, what I tell the people I work with is if in preoccupied, you oversee things sometimes, that in this one, you maybe undersee things in relationships where, and it's not even underseeing because that even implies that they're actually seeing it, right? But it's sometimes I try to raise awareness. It's like, well, what are the ways in which something was right in front of you and you didn't even see it with this attachment style? And then with preoccupied, I'll sometimes say, what are the ways you're actually believing a narrative that's not actually there, for self-protection? And so that difference, I think, is really important.
Yeah, Kurt Thompson in his book Anatomy of the Soul talks a little bit about attachment styles, and he talks in there about how this part of our brain, I don't know what it is because he's way more nerdy than I am, but this part of our brain that interprets the body signals from our body that get interpreted into emotions. And it's also the part of our brain that interprets body language from others regarding emotions. That is smaller and less developed in people with avoidant attachment. Our brain actually changes so that we can't notice emotions as much, which is totally like a self-protective way of doing it.
That's super fascinating. What are the ways in which, like in terms of spirituality, what are the ways in which an avoidant spirituality would show up in people's lives?
Yeah, I think it goes both ways, because people will use faith to shut down their emotions, and also they'll shut down their emotions in order to engage in faith. So it might be like, I can't feel sad, I can't feel doubt, I can't feel anxiety, right? Like Francis Chan says, worry and stress are arrogant like emotions that reek to God, something like that, right? So basically this idea of like, if you feel, something
good
bad,
face, Amy.
Yeah,
right?
Good face.
So this idea that like, if you have bad emotion, that's gonna drive God away, just in the same way that like, if I was crying or upset, like my parent got mad or went in the other room or whatever, right? Same exact thing.
Yeah.
But the flip of that, not the flip, but the way it can go the other way is when we use faith to shut down our emotions. So maybe it's like, I'm really worried about this thing. I'm worried about, getting a job. But instead of reaching out and telling my partner or friend, like, hey, I'm really worried about a job and getting comfort, we say, it'll be fine. I don't need to feel worried because God's got it. Right. Which would be, there's a word for it, spiritual bypass. There's actually like a clinical word for that. What do you think about this, Amy?
I'm just remembering, and I'm going to butcher it, which I hate when I can't remember like a quote properly. But Richard Rohr talks about this idea that faith used to mean, right, that we could basically believe in things that we didn't see, right? Like there's this space for like faith. Faith is being comfortable, being uncomfortable, right? And not knowing everything. And somehow faith has turned into being sure of things we don't know, right? I'm trying to remember exactly how it says it, right? Faith used to be being sure that there were things we didn't know and being okay with it, right? And somehow we've turned faith, particularly in American evangelicalism, into being sure of things that we can't know. And I think about that a lot with how I feel, how relationally avoidant the certain portions of the evangelical church have become, right?
Yeah.
I won't get overly political on your podcast because I don't know how political you get on your podcast, but if you look at certain things that are happening, if you look at certain movements in the United States where people are asking for, to be treated like human beings and to be cared for and seen, right? And the response of the evangelical church to that is that you're not being unified, right? Unity is a great example of something that is a product of loving relationship. It is not the goal, right?
That's good.
Unity is what happens when we love each other and are safe with each other and treat each other well. Unity is not the goal. Unity is not what God is asking us for. Unity is what happens when we do what God is asking us for.
That's so good.
And so you see this like large theological movement happening that is so wildly dismissive. So I think the thing about avoidant dismissive, right, is, well, your experience is that you were dismissed, and now you often go on to dismiss others, right? And we see so much of this in American evangelicalism. We see so much dismissive narrative and dismissive theology around people's honest, real human experience.
Well, I just want to throw a little research in there. There's actually research that has shown that people with this attachment style, because they're avoiding their emotions, they will stick to their rigid way of thinking about things. That the study was about rigid cognitive frameworks, I think. Because what happens is, so I have this view on this thing that I've had my whole life, right? In order to change my view on that, I have to engage in an emotional experience. And I also have to step into the waters of anxiety of like, here's this difficult issue and I don't know the answer anymore. I used to, and if I have the right answers, I can kind of lock that anxiety away. But this actually requires me to like step into a more vulnerable place, listen to the emotions of others, and also get in touch with my own emotions. And so, that's where, like, I mean, recently, at a church where I was talking to people about LGBTQIA issues, and people are like, yeah, I wish it could be different, but like, this is just what the Bible says. And within that is and I don't really want to hear, this is implicit, but like, I don't want to hear the stories of people, because that won't change. That's not going to change the truth, the like black and white truth.
One of the most, that's so profound. And I find that one of the, particularly the older generation, which would be that John Wayne generation. I mean, that was celebrated. I mean, he was, and I find within the church, and you can find that in any generation, is that you'll it's called building your house on sand. And the higher you go, the more shaky it becomes. Reality is I've been in the room, I've had the conversation where you can see that love is winning this conversation. It's just unraveling, and love is winning the conversation, and it is shut down on the basis often of what I understand about what the Bible says. And I built too much of my house on this. I built too much on this foundation, and it would cost too much and hurt too much. And so I am unwilling to go back down to the bottom. And so part of me, when I'm in the room, I'm like, man, like there's such freedom on the other side of this pain, but you're not willing to actually and dive into the pain. And you're giving me a little bit more language for understanding being in those rooms. A lot of time it's older generation, but it isn't always. But the Bible, of course, is the thing. It's suddenly that literal reading of the Bible becomes the most important thing, even though it makes no sense intellectually. And we can work through all of that academically. You can approach it relationally. At the end of the day, they're unwilling to be moved from this foundational belief. And I think you've helped me understand a little bit more about
Amy's
that.
coming. I can feel it. She's coming.
Yeah.
One thing that I think really traps people, and I feel like I'm witnessing this day in, day out currently. One thing that traps people is, okay, so you're talking about this idea, right, that we could maybe untangle some of these theologies, right, some of these problematic theologies if we weren't so nervous, right, which requires us to untangle a theology that we've been handed that doubt is inappropriate, right? You have to engage doubt in order to change a belief,
That's
right?
good.
Because you have to be willing to question where you're at. But we have been taught that doubt is inappropriate. So we've trapped people in these like Pharisaical layers of law and theology that keep them from even being able to engaging.
Wow, that's really profound.
Yeah. Which is so interesting, because if you study Jewish literature, they were doing this all the time, which is very different than Christianity, because if you doubt something, it's like that's a slippery slope. But if you study what was happening at the time of Jesus, it was actually part of their tradition. Somebody would say something, then somebody would say, actually, no, I don't. Yep. And here's why. And so there was like this thing called critical thinking that was actually happening, right? Yeah. But one of the things too, before we moved on to spirituality and preoccupied, one of the things too that I think happens with American evangelicalism is that it is a heady tradition, if we're honest with ourselves, because of the Reformed kind of space that it holds sometimes, which I'm not just like speaking bad about Reformed people. I've learned a lot from people that are Reformed, but it becomes so systematic and heady and about facts and about systems that there's not a whole lot of space for heart stuff.
Have you heard of the book Gentler God by Doug Frank?
I've heard of Doug Frank, but I haven't read the book. Yeah.
Such a great book on this topic. Like, this was one of the first starting places, but he actually looks at the history of American evangelicalism, and he kind of makes this argument that that we actually ended up in our heads to take shelter from the wrathful God of fundamentalism.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely.
So like, you have this angry, wrathful God, and it's like, well, at least if we can kind of go into these logical, like systematic theology things, that we can have a different like relationship with God, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah. It is.
Wow.
One thing about the head and the heart part, and this is just such an important thing to understand, whether it's spiritually or in relationships, I work with couples. And so usually if one partner that's like, I want to know what's going on with you. Like, I want to know you. I want to have an emotional connection. And the other partner's like, no, I don't have it. Like, what do you mean? What am I feeling? Like, I'm not feeling anything. Right.
Yeah.
And what's actually going on there is when you shared emotions before growing up, it actually led to disconnection.
Wow.
That is a scary place to be. And two, no one ever helped you with these emotions. The only strategy that you had was to just push them down, shut them off. I use this. I'm writing a book right now on this topic. And I was looking at this idea of shut down spirituality and this, approach to the dismissive avoidant. And a lot of times other people will be like, you're shutting me out, right? You're like this house and you've drawn all the blinds. But for the person, it's like, no, it's not that. It's actually like, I've stuffed all the feelings in the basement and I don't know what they are either. I don't know what I'm feeling. And why would I want to go down there? Because it's just painful. It only leads to disconnection. And I have no idea what I would do with those feelings if I felt them anyway. No one's ever helped me know how to calm down from an emotion, know how to interpret what's going on in my body. Like the best thing for me was just to shut it down. And I think that's like such an important thing to recognize. There's this YouTube video of John Piper at the 2012 American Christian Counselor Association. And it's interesting. I mean, if you watch that and you know about avoidant attachment, he basically says like, there are two things going on. One is the audience was told that it was supposed to be funny. So he's sharing these heartfelt things and everyone's laughing. It's very uncomfortable. But the other part of it is that he talks about, he's like, I'm someone that like doesn't do well with emotions. I get overwhelmed easily. Like when I feel, he said, like, I pity myself really quickly, which is a way, like what I took from that was he's saying like, I feel like I shouldn't have these negative emotions. And I heard that. I'm like, yeah, here's someone that like doesn't know how to connect very well emotionally because no one taught him. Minnesota nice, Minnesota ice. I lived there for a few years, and you learn to just like not really emotionally engage, and then it plays out in our spirituality and our theologies in ways that are harmful to people.
Yeah.
Could we talk about preoccupied a little bit? I know we've kept you guys for a while, but with the circles that Jason and I grew up with, preoccupied is probably more of the Christian culture we grew up with because it's charismatic and Pentecostal leanings, which is very into like, more. And so could you guys talk a little bit about what it looks like in preoccupied attachment?
Yeah. Can I just want to share something real quick about the research. And then I want to hear Amy, because that's your corner. We were just talking about this week we recorded a podcast about worship music and attachment styles. So, but one thing that Todd Hall did this research a few years ago, Todd Hall and a few others, that found that people that do this sort of like getting really emotionally demonstrative to feel close to God, like we do in charismatic circles, it doesn't create secure attachment. It doesn't change the way that you relate to God internally. It actually reaffirms it. It reaffirms that like, in order to feel close to God, I have to put in all this effort. I have to get really big and loud and make myself feel this way. And then over time, as so that's Sunday, and then by Friday it's like, oh, I'm feeling really anxious. Like, am I connected to God? Because I haven't had that like worship experience in a while.
And it needs to be 2 hours, otherwise we didn't have a worship experience.
Right? Yeah. So that's what the research says. Amy, from the ground. Ground level. Tell us what goes.
One metaphor I always like to bring up here. I don't know if anyone else was taught this. Krispin wasn't familiar with it, but maybe y'all will be, which is that I was taught as a kid, right, that if you're not moving towards God, you're moving away. Right? Like it's a conveyor belt going in the opposite direction of God, which is the most bonkers thing I've ever heard in my entire life. I come from a short tradition of charismatic Christians. The first Christian in my family was my grandpa. And he was saved like hard Assemblies of God. like works for the prayer lines, like the whole shebang.
Right.
So it's like we're a short history, but a strong charismatic history in that short. And yeah, there is a lot of focus, I think, in more preoccupied, I think where it's birthed out of, is this focus on like the tangibles, right? Right, because avoidant kind of does this thing we were just talking about, right? Avoidant does this thing that's like, regardless of the evidence, this is the truth, right? We don't want any evidence, and we certainly don't want it to be emotional. With preoccupied, there's a lot more focused on like, right, if you're getting real charismatic, there's all the fruits of the Spirit, right? That if you really have the Holy Spirit inside of you, there will be tangible proof that will manifest in all of these different ways that people can totally make up, but whatever. So there's incredible pressure that how I show up in the world, show up in the Christian space, would be a reflection of how close I am to God, which is wild in its own right, but I do think creates like a performative nature in our faith.
Yes.
I think in like an ambivalent attachment, right? And then you feel guilty about it, right? So it is that it's very ambivalent actually, right? Because you're experiencing these strong push-pulls, right? Of like, I'm going to show up and I'm going to speak in tongues, and then I'm going to spend the next month doubting that was actually me speaking in tongues, right? Like we're going to do this thing all the time. And then it happens on lesser levels, right? Of like, I'm going to pray and I feel like I heard a word, and then if it doesn't play out the way that I thought it would, did I really hear that? Did I make that up? And then I feel guilty about that. There's this really big, it's a roller coaster a lot of times of high emotional highs and then like deep guilt and doubt, right? But in myself, right? I'm not allowed to doubt God still. We're not allowed to doubt God in preoccupied spiritual attachment either. But I doubt myself, right? I doubt the reality and the truth of my spiritual experience. And it is all over because there's this desperation too, right? And it's written into, we were talking about this with worship music, like the number on my like insecure attachment worship songs. I was like, I just wrote like anything that's begging God to change me into not being me, right? Like anything that has
I'm desperate for you. I'm lost without you.
Yeah,
we talked about that one.
You're gonna love it.
I brought that one to the table.
Is so birthed in this like, I am impure and no good, right? I'm not okay, right? And so I'm always trying to move out of my humanity somehow into divinity, which is going to fail every single time. So I'm going to spend all of my spiritual energy feeling racked with guilt, right? Because I'm
also
always
weird.
failing.
Right, and also weird for a God that became human.
Yeah.
I just always am on the like, all of this stuff paints such a tiny picture of the divine, right?
Yeah.
It is so, like, if we are worried about insulting God, I am worried that these theologies insult God because they insult the grandness of a divine father, mother, being, right? Who created the entirety of the universe and created the entirety of the universes that exist within us. And to say that like God can be insulted or is not interested in being around us or doesn't like God's creation is just, I just get so mad.
I love it. I love this because for me, I'm Desperate for You, that song, and is... Well, I've written a book and I actually talk about this song. And I'll say this. First, I had incredible God times with that song. Because here's the most amazing thing. God is a good father. And he'll meet with us regardless of our brokenness, our understanding, our language, all of our theology, all of our ideology. He steps inside of our mess and he... From the inside out, he just loves us in our charismaticness. He loves us in our, you know what I'm saying, in our Baptistness. He loves us in our Eastern Orthodox. So my point is that I had amazing encounters. I grew up in that charismatic, I'm desperate for you. One of the most profound things in my life happened probably 13, 14 years ago. And the short story is essentially that my father basically came to me and said, hey, am I a good father? To which you can answer yes. And he said, well, then if there's desperation in our relationship, it's not on my end. And what began to happen in me is I realized, if you're a dad, you realize the last thing you want is desperate kids. You know, if I was walking around and I needed my kids to sing to me every once in a while, I'm desperate for you. There's something seriously wrong on my end. And yet we have attributed that kind of nature to God. We've attributed that to like he somehow needs us. I love what you said about these worship songs based on our need. How did you say it?
We paint a really insecure God, don't we?
Yeah, and you paint. Well, I forget how you said it, but you basically said there's like all these worship songs that are about how big He is and how desperate we are and our great needs. And one of the things I love to teach on is when Paul talks about grace, and he talks about the thorn in the flesh and all of this. We have a children's song where we sing, "Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me, little ones to Him belong. I am weak, but He is strong." And it's not even biblical. The scripture is actually, when I am weak, then I am strong, which is completely different than what we have taught over and over and over again. And it's not that it isn't true. It isn't that He isn't strong or that we can't be weak, but there's something amazing about His goodness. Anyway, I know what you're saying it's so helpful to understand it. I know what you're saying is not anything about His nature, but it is an understanding of why am I striving? Why do I have to go to the next conference? Why am I by Friday exhausted? Why do I need to listen to worship music 24/7? Why, and that can be an actual great evidence of dysfunction. That was basically what happened 13 years ago was I found out there was dysfunction in our relationship, and it was on my end because I'd required a certain level of desperation. I'd connected that to my spirituality.
Yeah. And what's underlying that is often shame, is this feeling like there's something about me that's unlovable, that's not worth sticking around for. Wow. I can't trust that God is going to take steps towards me. I got to take steps towards God.
Wow.
And then what we do in the church, in the churches I've been in, is we reaffirm that shame in this way that we're trying to praise God for His goodness, and I'm all for that. Yeah. But we say things like, "You shouldn't love me. I'm a total wretch."
Yeah.
And
I
that
don't
just
deserve it.
Right. I don't deserve it. We talked about that in a worship song.
I can't stand that line.
And, and it's like, by what, this gets philosophical, but by what, if God loves us, like by what other standard can we measure wver or not we should be loved?
That is exactly good. That's so profound and good, man.
But I love it because a lot of evangelicals love Brene Brown, right? And Brene Brown's definition of shame is like, I haven't met a certain standard, therefore I'm undeserving of love and belonging. And that's like literally like what we say in the church all the time. Like you've messed up so much that you don't deserve belonging and you don't deserve God's love.
Well, Krispin, you're actually born that messed up. You started out that way. You didn't have a chance. Don't forget about that part.
Right.
Well, this is why it's so important. This is why I think attachment is so important, because if you go to the other side and we start talking about avoidant, if I'm hearing you correctly, there's such a confidence that I am the greatest thing ever and you're the one that, right? Like you're the one that needs help with. And so I think a spirituality that is able to recognize both, I think is really, really helpful. But yeah, I think in our circles, there's a lot more of that. More. And I've shared about this on the podcast before, but I went through a period where I was praying more, I was doing more, I was staying up and late and praying for God, all these things that my tradition passed down. And my wife literally said to me, she's like, you are angrier, crankier, more judgmental, like this is not working. And honestly, though, it was in that conversation where I felt comfortable to ask the question, maybe the narratives or the ideas of God that were passed down to me and how to quote unquote get closer to God are actually faulty. And it actually started a process and a deconstruction process where I felt comfortable to be like, I'm actually not becoming a better person just because I'm doing these things. So yeah, that's why I think attachment is so, so important.
Yeah, and I think it makes me think about this part of it. It's kind of like a obscure kind of like related theory to attachment, but this idea that that we need, especially as babies, to go into a yield state, which is where this place where we're not reaching, we're not striving, we're just present. And it actually like helps us regulate our mood. It helps regulate our that helps us tell us that our bodies that we're full. So we actually like don't have this like need to like eat more and more, which is, I was hearing that and I was like, that's kind of a parallel to Sabbath, right? Like this idea of resting. And actually it's in resting that it helps us not be greedy and not want more and more and have this security. And so but like the Lord's Day is not a Sabbath day for so many of us. It's a day to prove to God that we really love, that we're really committed and we really love God, and and it's exhausting.
Yeah, I think it's important to think about it as it's not, because I think a lot of people would take out of this conversation like, oh, well, you got to do like a balance, right? Not too much striving, not too much whatever. But it's none of it. Right? Yeah. Like secure attachment isn't in between ambivalent and avoidant attachment. It is outside of it. Right? It is a rest and a security and a confidence that God is taking care of you, and God is alive in you, and God is present with you, and God is joyful with you, regardless of whether you showed up to church on Sunday. Regardless of the last time you prayed, you actually have had no effect on God's presence or joy or grace on you. Nothing you can do will affect it. And if that feeling is not creating freedom, then that's indicative that we have farther to go in secure attachment with God. If we are experiencing anything other than joy and freedom in our relationship with God, that is speaking to something outside of God's love and presence and personhood with us.
That is so good. I say this, Jesus came to reveal the Father, but he also came to show us what it looks like to live confident as his child. And he lived securely attached. And at 30 years of age, there's this voice from heaven. He goes under the water, he comes up, this is my son. There's that identity release. I love him. And not only do I love him, but I'm well pleased with him. And I love to tell the story because Jesus got a well pleased before he did any of the things that we read about in the four Gospels. He got a well pleased before he raised the dead or healed the sick or walked on water, all the things that we would consider ministry or Christian faith or what the evidence of it looks like. He got a well pleased before he went to a cross, before he rose. In fact, he did everything from, this is my son, I love him, I am pleased with him. And basically he did everything from this sense of security in his father and his identity and who he was as his father's child, as his beloved. And everything he did then was an expression, an overflow, an abundance from that secure attachment. Is that a right way of saying this? Do I get secure attachment? Do I understand? Am I starting to get this theory?
I think you do.
There's actually... there's this fantastic book that just came out by my friend Jeffrey Ulrich, about faith and faith and attachment and parenting. And he's actually done some research that shows that delight is one of the biggest predictors of secure attachment.
Yeah. I love it.
There you go.
Thanks. I love it. I've actually been writing about this a lot, that I believe that there's three things that we need from that. Again, now I'm not as a counselor, I'm coming at it more from this relational dynamic, but I look, this is my son, you know who you are, I'm my dad's boy or my dad's girl, or my mom's boy, or it's whom I love, foundational. There's nothing you can do. I love you. But then this pleasure piece, that's the part that I've been really diving in lately. I'm like, I think all my empowering, all my energy, all my desire, all my drive, all the good things that I'm wanting to pursue come out of my Father's pleasure, knowing that he's pleased with me, even before I've done all the stuff, just because that I'm his kid and he's my dad. And I love that. That's beautiful. You guys are awesome. This was so much. Much fun.
Thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Before we want to talk to you guys about tacos, since it's Rethinking God with Tacos.
Yeah.
But before we do that, I wanted to share, you talked about Sue Johnson, Krispin, and I don't know that Sue, I don't know where Sue is at spiritually. It doesn't really matter. But I heard her on a podcast once say that she thinks Jesus is the most like it's the primary example of what it means to be a securely attached person, right?
Wow.
Like always available, always responsive, not overly like clingy or needy, right? Still having his boundaries, but I always that always kind of stuck with me when Sue Johnson said that. I thought that was really cool. Yeah.
You like tacos?
Yes.
I can talk about attachment in tacos. I mean, if we grew up in a certain family, right? Like it just feels normal. We don't know what we don't know.
That's
which is why when I was 18 and I was at my aunt's house and we were eating tacos and I pulled ketchup out of the fridge.
Oh no!
Like, what are you doing? And I was like, we're eating tacos.
Oh,
like, doesn't everyone put ketchup on their tacos?
Oh man, I can't even believe you told that story in public.
That's amazing.
That's awesome.
I love food so much. Food is so important to me. I'm like a big believer that cooking for people is like an entire love language all on its own.
Yes, it is.
And that story breaks my heart, Krispin.
What about you, Amy? Do you have a favorite kind of taco?
Are you a hard shell or a soft shell?
Oh, soft shell. I definitely grew up with the like ground beef and hard shell thing, and I've never eaten it since. I'm a big fan of carnitas. When I lived in Guatemala for a summer, they did carnitas, but they also put pineapple on it, and that was like everything. And I've never done it since I've been home, but I am reminding myself right now that I need to. So
I had a street taco in Guatemala. Where were you in Guatemala?
I spent about a month in Antigua and about a month in El Capital.
Okay.
Oh, cool.
Antigua is beautiful.
Antigua is beautiful. It's super cool.
Yeah,
it's really rad.
Wow. Hey, tell us about the podcast. Tell us about where we can find you guys.
All that stuff.
So we have a podcast called Attached to the Invisible, where we talk about attachment and spirituality. And I'm on Twitter. You can search Krispin Mayfield with a K, K __ Mayfield on Twitter. And I'm also on Instagram. You can just search me there. Amy, where are you at?
I am only on Instagram. You can find me at AmyK214, I think. That seems right. That's where I do most of my talking about things. AMY. I'm the boring type of Amy.
Thank you so much for having us on to talk about these things. I just think, it's endless. As you can tell, we could have talked for hours about.
I had like 5 or 6 questions and I just was like, no, we'll have to do it another time.
Right. Well, you can always still ask us questions. It turns out we don't have to be recording for that to happen.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
This was a real treat for us. Thank you guys so much.
Yeah.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you guys.
Very fun.
Hey guys, thanks for listening to this episode. We hope it encouraged. We had a lot of fun making it.
If you guys want to subscribe to this podcast, please do. We're on Apple Podcasts, Spotify,
all of them.
Anywhere you might listen to podcasts.
And leave a review. Yeah,
that'd be great.
Especially if it's a good review. We're just getting started, right?
We don't want bad reviews.
No. Also, if you want to follow us on social media, you can go to, I know this man has a Twitter account. We both do. And if you want to find us online, we're at afamilystory.org, afamilystory.org. Also, you can reach me there if you want to get a hold of us for any reason at jason@afamilystory.org.
We're excited that you guys are on this journey with us, and we look forward to releasing more content.
Yeah, thanks. See you.